Okay, you should be good.
Panel, I will talk about agency, and then I will talk about restrictive and conservative parents and the effect they will have on their children under side government. And lastly, I will just deal with remaining miscellaneous points of analysis that we hear from opening government. So let's start with agency. And my biggest problem with opening government is that they try to portray a world in which what happens is that they stop children from being sent to juvenile prison in exchange of no abuse. Here's my problem with that. The first problem is that I think the cases in which the alternative to this bill would be that children would be sent to juvenile prison or end up suffering massive corporal punishment are very, very small number of cases. You know why? Because we as a society have evolved towards recognizing that children should be given at least some autonomy, and that punishing your child in extreme ways is not something that is socially acceptable. That is something that is most likely going to be reversed in terms of agency with this bill. Kat has already given you the analysis on why it is, because it is more convenient in the moment to give your child this pill, especially when everyone around you is either behaving or has taken the pill themselves, and why that is going to slowly normalize giving the pill, which means that more and more children are going to be given the pill for less and less, divergence from whatever is expected to be the norm, which probably means that what we are going to see is that even parents who might not have initially started out by wanting to give their children the pill are now going to start giving their children this pill more and more often. But I just reject the idea that it is not an abuse to override your child's agency, right? Because the prime minister kind of tries to frame it as it's just like ADHD medication. You still do the same thing you would have done otherwise, but like your self-control is a bit stronger, right? The problem is that they ignore the Infoslide that explicitly states that you are not able to take actions that go against laws or that go against what your parents see as obedient and go against what is expected of you, right? That literally means, as Kat has also already pointed out, that you still want to do those things. You still have the memory of your agency pushing you into a different direction, but you're simply physically not able to do that. If you would still be able to do that, then this pill wouldn't do anything and we would not be having this debate, right? What I think is that this massive it's not even overriding your agency, right? It's just simply prohibiting you from expressing your agency. I think that is the worst type of abuse that I can think of. And I think it would be much better to throw every child in juvenile prison if that's what it takes to prevent them from selling drugs on the street, rather than telling them at every step that their agency is not worth it, right? I asked OG what they think about bullying, and they basically agree that it would be great to stop bullying at every level. Here's what bullying is. Bullying is someone prohibiting you from expressing your agency because it doesn't align with what it is they want. That is literally what this pill also does, but on a whole new scale and on a worse level. Let's look at OG trying to mitigate their harms, but saying that there's no net change in agency if you're a good kid. Here's the thing. I think the vast majority of children will never end up taking drugs or, taking anything other than smoking a joint once in a while, and will never end up in correctional facilities. However, they do deviate from what their parents want on a daily basis, many, many times a day, right? Things that I did that my father would have probably given me the skill to prevent, that didn't prevent me from turning out just fine, are things like having a boyfriend, things like being friends with people who are older than me that my parents disapproved of because they drank beer every now and then, things like watching series instead of doing my homework because I was just so exhausted from school and I needed a way to recreate, talking back at teachers, not doing my homework. Like, there are any number of things that would end up getting your parents called to school to demand that you give your children this pill that aren't actually harmful, right? That are just simply children doing whatever it is that feels good to themselves, right? And let's look at OG's response of like, oh, but you don't have any informed consent to rebel because you don't actually know what the consequences are and what kind of damage your parents might inflict on you in response. I think one, that might be true the first time you do something and get punished, but it's definitely not true in all the subsequent times that you repeat a behavior will be punished for, but you still choose to do it. If you still choose to do it despite knowing the punishment, what that tells you is that the child knows that there is some sort of restriction to their freedom that is coming their way, but they still decide that expressing their autonomy and expressing their free will and risking that subsequent restriction of autonomy in very restricted physical ways is still preferable to just giving up on whatever the preferences are, right? And I also think that maybe at 6 years old, you don't really know what you're choosing, but also 6-year-olds don't tend to do really, really bad things and don't tend to end up in juvenile prison, right? I think 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds are pretty aware of what consequences there are. And the reasons why they keep making bad decisions probably have more to do with them not having enough of a support network or not having the feeling that they can be happy in another way, rather than there is not enough pressure applied on them. But also like, just looking at the way opening government frames this debate is like, otherwise there would be strict tiger parenting. I think there's a very small minority of parents that engage in such strict punishments, and I think if they do, it is because it is socially acceptable. I think that allowing parents to give this pill and then allowing the norm to be created around this pill, that is okay to give your children this pill because you're trying to protect them and you're doing their best and you're not actually causing that much harm, and it's better than punishing them in another way. Those are exactly the reasons why it is going to lead to more and more of this type of abuse being justified and becoming the norm, right? Also, OG, maybe stop using capital punishment, because I don't think you actually mean capital punishment when you say that's what's going to be applied. But also just the idea that comes out in PM that like forcing kids into therapy to potentially get medication for depression or ADHD, which are actually disorders, is more severe than taking a pill that overrides your autonomy. It's just quite offensive and wild to me, right? Because therapy is about someone being respectful and understanding of your will and hearing you and talking with you through whatever it is that you're going through in a way that otherwise you might not be able to do with your parents, and ultimately still allowing you to exercise your autonomy and make decisions, right? I would be very happy to ask for every child to have access to free therapy, because I think that would be beneficial for them. And I think this is the literal opposite to making them take a pill that will override their free will, right? But also, let's look at restrictive and oppressive parents, because I think most of them aren't malicious. They try to impose on children whatever they think the correct life is. And OG themselves claim that most parents raise children as an extension of themselves, right? The problem is that it is not possible for parents to know a priori what is best for their child, but also most parents don't really understand what their children are going through, and they're going to know even less about what their children are going through if we teach the children, if they express desire to rebel against their parents, they will get a pill that will make it literally impossible for them to do whatever it is they think. I think this pill is the worst type of abuse we could have. I am very proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and welcome the Member of Government.
Sorry, can I just check that I'm audible there?
Yeah, you are.
Cool, just let me get some tabs up so I have all my notes together. Sorry. Okay, starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Going to do a couple things in this speech. Firstly, why this only applies in niche circumstances where there are probably very few alternatives available to parents. Secondly, why this maximizes long-term agency and why we probably win the agency trade-off. Okay, I'm going to just do a little bit of integrated rebuttal, but also just starting off with some reframing that I think is important here for context. What kind of parents are going to use these pills? Probably not a huge number of them, just based on the fact that most parents will find fucking creepy and weird and probably perceive it as an unnecessary intervention. Why is this true? Number one, most parents love their kids, they afford them a modicum of respect, and they don't like the concept that they could possibly be altering aspects of the personality of the person they claim to love. This becomes more important because personalization or growth of responsibilities and freedom that are put upon children grow as they age, which means parents are even less and less likely to use this as kids get older. Secondly, most people follow the naturalistic fallacy to some extent, especially when it comes to medical interventions that they perceive as unnatural and they therefore perceive it to be bad. This is why marketing of stuff towards parents for like baby stuff is always saying that it's really organic and it has no no toxins or whatever. This is also why mothers are the most susceptible group to be taken into anti-vaxxer movements, and they're very susceptible to the idea that vaccines are bad because they are unnecessary, or they are an unnatural intervention into an otherwise healthy child. Thirdly, parenting advice is already kind of a cottage industry, right? And also it's a sign of social value, or often parents use it as their shining accomplishment, or it's a form of middle-class performance, right? To a certain extent, for many parents, the act of parenting itself is a virtue. I think what this means is it's very likely parents will fear being perceived as lazy or bad parents for taking the quote-unquote easy way out. I think this is intensified as kids get older because it's seen as forming a bad relationship with your older kids. This is probably why take-up will probably be limited to a very narrow frame. This is also probably the reason why all of these reasons are pretty inherent to the characteristics that we'd associate with parents. So I'd also like to note this is a lot less speculative than what we get out of OG about like political opposition. That's pretty vague. Okay, so in which circumstances are parents doing this at a level enough to matter? So even if we merit that some parents do this on one-off occasions, when is this pill used to an extent that it is enough to accrue like larger impacts? Probably only in exceptional circumstances, and probably only when there are very few reasonable alternatives. This is probably the only time when parents will continuously use the pill on their child. This looks like firstly younger kids who have very little impulse control and probably very little ability to control their actions in the first place, being affected by firstly instances where the child in question is facing immense external stress that has rapidly deteriorated their ability to, number one, moderate their emotions, and also consider others in their actions. But instead, they begin to lash out as a way of externalizing issues that they lack the language or emotional intelligence to articulate or internally moderate. For example, children who have lost a parent or a loved one who are experiencing overwhelming grief, they're unequipped to deal with in any way, shape, or form. Secondly, instances where a child has already experienced prior neglect and has not been afforded the tools required to function in society because they've not been taught them. Both circumstances, I'd like to note that the child, which is the most vulnerable actor in this debate, has already been failed to a certain extent, and we have a huge duty to them. But also note that in both circumstances, the agency of the child has been hugely limited by circumstances that are entirely outside of their control. But also note, this is why OO is uncomparative. The OO are reliant on reaching critical take-up to the point that schools are firing counselors and the entire standard of child behavior is being raised. I just don't believe the parents will do this. I'm not giving any analysis for why this is likely to be true, other than what OO tell us, which is that there will be competition between kids to perform well in school, which means that parents will do it. Note that cheating on tests is another socially unacceptable way for kids to get ahead. It does happen to some extent, but parents aren't all facilitating their child's cheating on standardized tests because of the guilt or social shame that they would experience if they were to do that. Oh, don't get their impacts. They only apply to a few instances, which means that they can't say that the entire standard of child behavior changes. Note then, this is also why we can still get behavioral reinforcement in teaching regardless of OO attacks on the OG case, because normalization of pill use is a contingent for removing positive reinforcement that OO tells us makes it impossible to teach kids anything. Insofar as we prove this doesn't become a norm, we still get positive reinforcement, which means we're also able to shape children's behavior. I also note there's an alternative mechanism for how we're able to shape kids' behavior. People are generally creatures of habit. Maybe I only started off like brushing my teeth when I was younger because my parents threatened that I'd have an early bedtime if I didn't do it. But once you do things enough times, sometimes you kind of just keep doing them, even if you don't really know what the reason is. So I think we probably still get behavioral reinforcement, and we get more of it because kids just start doing things that are socially more acceptable without really thinking too hard about why they're doing them. Why then is this principally legitimate, and how do we maximize agency? Okay, characterization here. Children already can't consent to much. OG gives some examples, but doesn't really analyze why they are analogous. I'm going to do that now. Why can't kids consent to decisions? Why do we let parents make decisions on their behalf? Number one, children lack the necessary information to understand the consequences of their actions. An easy example here, kids don't understand what exactly physical danger looks like or what it poses like adults do. This is why they need to be told not to play on train tracks. Number two, kids lack impulse control and long-term reasoning. This is why little kids fail the marshmallow test. Number three, they lack empathy. A lot of kids don't have theory of mind, and they're not really aware that other people have emotions and that their actions affect other people in positive or negative ways. What this probably means with our characterization, this is mostly young kids, is that we're affecting a group that already have very limited agency. I'll take OO very quickly.
fear of being natural or not is considerably more abstract than the concrete fear of your kid being like the kid that was on the news for falling into drugs. You can rationalize to yourself that this is still your kid and that it's still your unique personality, just a bit easier to deal with.
It's also, okay, it's socially unacceptable for parents to like help their kids cheat on tests. It's socially unacceptable for parents to lock their kids up in the basement. Like there's a lot of things parents could do that would theoretically produce better offspring that are like more efficient or better capitalist workers or something, that they just don't do because it's not socially acceptable. Okay, what's important then here is that on both sides, kids lack agency anyway, but there's a huge behavioral difference that has long-term impacts on opposition side when the kids in exceptional circumstances are not afforded the ability to improve their behavior when they don't have control on either side. What this means is they get things like poor disciplinary records. It means their academic records begin to suffer. It means they have bad habit formation that follows through further on into life, none of which they have any control over. But overall, you are decreasing their ability to make future choices because you're eliminating their level of access to opportunities. I can't decide to go to university. I can't make a very important decision about the future course of my life if I don't have the option to, because my academic record was poor, because I was unable to moderate my emotions in school and I ended up lashing out all of the time. Why do we prioritize maximizing long-term agency and decision making? Because it's just bigger on scale. I think it's probably more important that the long-term trajectory of a child's life maximizes their ability to make choices about their conception of the good life and live a life that they feel is fulfilling and good than it is to stop them from like screaming in school or like drumming on their desks or doing something like this that is limiting their agency, but only for a short period of time, and it's pretty inconsequential. Proud to propose.
I thank the member of government and welcome the member of opposition.
Okay, just give me a minute to turn on my timer. I'll take POIs in the chat. I'll do my best to take a look. Yeah, hopefully I don't forget. Okay, speech starting in 3, 2, 1. So the world we're proposing is one where we don't limit the self-expression of children, where we don't limit the ways in which they express their own identities and learn to develop themselves throughout childhood. And that's why we believe that parents should not be allowed to give the politeness pill to their children without the children's consent. So in this speech, I'll be tackling a few things. First, I'm going to extend by talking about identity building in childhood in relation to the pill and the way it enforces socially acceptable behaviors. So I'm going to talk about how this pill stops us from expressing ourselves in terms of self-identity and why this is so crucial yet has been highly ignored in this debate. I'm not sure why, but we'll head into that in a minute. And then I'll also talk about the harmful uses of the pill by conservative parents. This is different from what has been discussed earlier, as it was focused on tiger parenting, not necessarily parents with conservative ideals. And rebuttals will be integrated. Okay, so a key idea for the speech that I'll be making today is what exactly is deemed socially acceptable. I think we have to recharacterize and reframe what this means for us to properly debate the motion. So socially acceptable behaviors are regarded as identities, actions, which fall under societal norms. So I think we can expand the debate a bit more by not just talking about, say, saying please and thank you or going to school, but also about considering what identities are acceptable in society. It's not just about staying quiet in a crowd when there's a performance, say. It's also about maybe not cross-dressing or not expressing yourself because in a certain society, it won't be deemed acceptable. So what do socially acceptable behaviors look like and which should we be focusing on in this debate? Okay, so let's take the example of a theater where everyone is quiet. I think this is a socially acceptable behavior, to pay attention and to listen, which is not necessarily debated upon. Most people will do this with or without the pill. It's not a behavior that is contested. Everyone kind of knows what to do. And that's not something that should really be focused on because we're not concerned about it because everyone already agrees on it. I think what we should be focusing on instead is socially acceptable behaviors that limit expression of self-identity through, say, clothing, political activism, and so on. So the pill would essentially limit this, which highly hinders a child's ability to build their own identity instead of being brainwashed by social norms. So why is this so important during childhood? Because this is a period in which one learns a lot about themselves by exploring different subcultures and means of self-expression. But it is also a time when children feel most scared of their parents' authority. Maybe when you're 30, you won't really care what your parent thinks if you go out hungover hungover, taking like 10 different types of shots at a bar. But obviously you will be thinking about this if you're doing it at, say, the age of 16. So we have to remember that children will probably think about their parents' authority more during this time. And because of that, their development is heavily shaped by the societal norms imposed by their parents. This is especially true for children living in conservative families. And we believe that conservative parents are very likely to use this pill. Why? Because the essence of conservatism revolves around the upholding of existing norms, or in other words, what is deemed socially acceptable. So what are the impacts of this? Most kids living in very conservative families are constantly supervised and told off for misbehavior at home. So at home, they're already expected to behave a certain way because they know their parents will always be watching them. And because of that, I think in the status quo in today's world where people living in conservative families don't get to express themselves at home, their only chance to truly be themselves is out of their homes. So their only chance to, say, dress the way they want or express their real political views is outside of their house, because they know that if they were to do so at home, their parents would definitely say something about it and say that, oh, this is wrong, we're gonna make you take the pill because now we realize that, you're thinking this way and it's not right, it's not socially acceptable. So what does this look like? Let's take one example. In a society where mental health is heavily stigmatized and people don't believe in, expressing your emotions because it's a sign of weakness, then maybe children who start showing symptoms of depression and other mental disorders will be told to take the pill. So if parents notice this and they're like, oh, we think that there's something wrong with your head or something wrong with the way you're thinking, you should take this pill, maybe it should make things better for you. Well, we think that this just further worsens the problem, because if children were to take this pill in a society where mental health is not openly talked about, then they would be less likely to seek external support networks. If they have to take the pill before they go outside of their house, the only times when they could really express themselves if they were to live in conservative families, then it would stop them from seeking help when they need it the most. Second, I think in societies where certain identities are not as accepted, say the LGBT minority in countries where it is heavily stigmatized, it leads to a lot of cognitive dissonance because the children feel as if their identities are highly conflicting with societal norms, and this leads to a lot of mental stress and harm. And this is especially difficult for children because, again, their brains are still developing, and just knowing that everything you are built on, everything your personality revolves around is something which is not socially acceptable will do some serious harm to your mental health. Yes, POI?
Trigger warning, but if these are really so socially unacceptable, then presumably society would punish you. Therefore, there's no meaningful distinction between the conservative parent and the conservative society.
Well, I think it goes back again to the idea that the only chance for people to be themselves is outside of the house, because even if society is the majority of society is conservative, it doesn't mean that you won't find anyone at all who shares your views. There will be groups who understand what you stand for and fight for the same things. So I think what we're trying to say is that there is still a much larger possibility for you to get to express yourself and understand your own identity and develop yourself as a person if you were able to fully do so outside of the house. But if your parents told you to take this pill before you left, then that would just hinder you from doing all of these things. I think just some other things we'd like to address in the debate is how this pill has constantly been compared to ADHD pills or antidepressants. Well, we think that this analogy doesn't work because you don't choose to have ADHD or depression, but this pill is entirely concerned with agency. This is something that really concerns what you want to do, not something you didn't choose to have, but you're affected by. And also, I think we've proved that a lot of parents will use this pill, conservative parents especially. And even if we assume that the government bench is correct, that most parents are not likely to use this pill, well, even if a lot of parents don't, it's still true that the harms on children in conservative families will be too large to ignore. So we feel like it's not something that can be disregarded at all in this debate. So I think today we've pointed out to you one of the most, if not the most crucial point in today's debate, which is about the development of children and their self-expression. Yeah, for all those reasons, so proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition and welcome the government whip.
Hello, I just have lots of papers. One sec. Oh, sorry, I think. Okay, POIs in the chat. I will definitely take. I'll probably take OO at around like the 5-minute mark. What is this debate actually about? Because I think I agree with our opening opposition that I think OG's stuff have gone for very extreme scenarios, and they talk about things like tiger parenting or corporal punishment. I think whilst this still stands, it's not a knife. I think these are probably the minority of cases in this debate and only exist on the marginal cases. Therefore, I think what Keris gives the unique contribution for this debate is when she actually tells you where this applies to. Because she tells you a couple of things. She tells you that one, parents really enjoy teaching their kids about life lessons. Like people choose to become parents with vast majority of time. It's a very active choice. They enjoy the prospect of like teaching little humans to do all the things that they do in life, and also teaching them their values and their morality system that is beyond the limits of just something that a pill can do, which means that the vast majority of parents who relish being parents and relish this type of discipline will not just revert to this pill. But secondly, also crucially, and even if this isn't the case, that there is social stigma associated with parents who are pressured to be involved with their kids' lives, to be actively taking these types of things. We see this existing in all types of parenting skills, and therefore I think it's very unlikely that a social stigma will occur where we just expect parents to just cast this aside and just give their kid a pill. Therefore, I think where is this more likely to be used? I think it's more likely to be used therefore when a child probably has something going on in their life in the short term that is very traumatic to them. This might be something like their parents are getting divorced, or maybe they've just lost a family member, which means that they're currently under quite a severe amount of stress that is causing them to act out at school. And clearly, I think this is also something where one, it is out of the control of both the child and the parent, and two, it is in a short-term instance. But thirdly, that stress is so acute that the behavior they're exhibiting at school is having a detrimental impact both on their learning and their long-term instances. And therefore, I think the question becomes, how do we alleviate their suffering? Do we want just let them act out at school, let them be labeled naughty and be cast aside by teachers so that it becomes to feel invalidated and probably no longer try at school, and eventually means they can't do things like probably go to uni because they didn't feel that they were ever validated at school or valued? Or two, do we give them a pill that temporarily alleviates their suffering so that they can do things like maintain their support network at school, keep good ties with their friends, keep good ties with their teachers, so that when this temporary externality is over, they still have the mechanisms at school to be able to go back and work hard and have all those maximum long-term choices? I think that's what this debate is about. I think that's why Keris wins. Therefore, comparing this to our opening up, I think we win for two reasons. I think we, one, just give you a more realistic scenario of when this is likely to occur. But two, I think we just show why this is legitimate in the long term. I think the children, therefore, the fact that those children are victims of circumstances because they have no control over their emotional outbursts. I think this also means that these children have been failed or neglected in the past, and we are doubly failing them by allowing their negative actions to accumulate and reinforce and remove their ability to make decisions or access opportunities in the future. I think we show the moral imperative to ensure these children are able to take that pill so they're not punished further for circumstances of their birth. And then I think before we prove that legitimacy choice and therefore are able to win the long-term clash. I'll quickly just do what we've heard with them. Unfortunately, we didn't get any responses from Sia. I think it's a bit late in the whip to do much, but I'll just quickly deal with their case instantly, because they try to set this in terms of like identity building within social conservative societies and stuff like that. I think it's important to note that if you are in a very conservative society, there are also already huge social costs associated with engaging in taboo behavior that can even be criminalized in some degrees. Therefore, I think on both sides, whilst you there is agency to access identity is undermined to some degree, whether it's through a pill, where the fact that you know by going outside and being openly gay, you will face things like social ostracization or maybe even prison. I think that agency is there on both sides of the house. I think also second, it's important to note that their stuff about not being able to form support works or identity building is dependent on this children being under this pill all of the time. This is a temporary pill. We have to assume that at least there are evenings or moments in their lives when they are not on this pill and they can do things like go on the internet and find support networks, or within their own personal time try to explore their personality to begin with. However, I think also crucial on our side, what we allow is that people can choose to opt into this society, this is socially unacceptable behavior once they become adults, and the salience of those social costs is actually clear to them, and consequently they can make a more informed choice on something that could have a massive long-term impact on them. For example, cross-dressing society, which can put you like for 10 years in prison. I think therefore we allow these people to make decisions when they are more able and rational to make those long-term calculus decisions, and therefore we do maximize their agency in the long term. So I think we still win on this clash. Then let's deal with OO to begin with. I think I'd first like to begin with OO's framing and then whether or not this teaches kids, because I think OO right is not just about tiger parents or extreme parents. However, I think with the important to note that I think this is short-term and is infrequent. Why? Because I think OO tried to say, parents are very risk averse and like naughty behavior will really stick out because suddenly all these kids are really, really well behaved. But I think it's important to know that most kids just are well behaved under the status quo, especially at places like school. I think kids just like, one, fear authority in general life, two, they don't want to be punished at school. It's not a pleasant opportunity for kids. But thirdly, I think kids like to be rewarded. Therefore, I don't think this is suddenly going to massively change the social makeup of society where being acting out is suddenly really going to stand out any more than it currently does and going to add an additional pressure to begin with. I think also parents trust their kids to be well behaved because of this. I think if you've never been called out once by the school and said your child is misbehaving, I'm unclear why you're suddenly going to stress that it is just because this pill exists. I think naughty kids already stick out. I therefore think it's unlikely this is ever going to be used preemptively. Parents don't undergo extreme measures now to make sure their kids are well behaved. And I think this may mean is only ever used potentially in extreme scenarios or in response to bad behavior at school. I think at home parents will not take this pill because they like to parent their kids. But I think, look, even if this is used and like parents are pressure to use at school, I think it will still be used in concurrence with other forms of parenting. I think you'll probably maybe give this pill at school, but when they're at home, try and deal with their problems and maybe still give them therapy and try to fix it. Why? Because one, this pill is temporary. As soon as that wears off in the evenings, that child is still going to have all those problems that you, a parent, probably have an incentive to fix. But secondly, parents care about them. They want to know their issues. They probably want to fix this in the long term. I think therefore it's very likely that they will still be involved. I think it's very likely that this will be very, very rarely used and they'll still be receiving other forms of help along this pill to help them. Finally, then on like, what can we teach their kids? I think it's important to note that stuff on like externality means that like kids' brains just aren't developed till they're like 25 years old. I'm unclear why they're ever to make those long-term rational calculus until they're even past the age of 18, especially if it's to do with the externality where they just feel undergoing stress, they're not able to make those rational decisions. But I think crucially importantly, like, is that when they say people can become creatures of habit, rely on this mechanism that you need positive and negative feedback. That's not true. We rewire our brains all the time. I teach myself habits all the time without getting any form of positive feedback. We can just do things by route. But secondly, kids still get positive feedback for good behavior because parents feel proud of their children because they are very nice. I don't compliment my friends because I want it to entrench good behavior. I just compliment it because I enjoy it. I like seeing them happy at the end. And thirdly, there will still be some forms of negative behavior because kids aren't always under this pill. They're not like backing them back and forth. Therefore, there'll still be other forms of parenting or need to explain bad behavior to kids in the evening or circumstances. Therefore, I think, what does all this mean? I still think in people, you're able to teach kids the value of good, important behaviors. But I think crucially, you alleviate lots of their suffering by not allowing them to face all the massive consequences of that behavior, especially when we feel they are unable to even make those long-term decisions in the first place. I think therefore, for all those reasons, we alleviate suffering in the long term, even for any short-term costs. I think it's far better than anything that other tones bring. For all those reasons,
I thank the government whip and welcome the opposition whip to close out today's debate and remind everyone to please take POIs.
I would take POI verbally, so just yell. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So let's deal with CG's case first, right? I think the strongest argument is the fact that parents who use this pill is usually for kids who, you know, are suffering from grief because some of their parents died or some of the family members died, that they cannot control their emotions and hence will lead to some rebellious, actions in school, leading to the long-term harms that they are talking about, right? But we crucially think that they fail to justify why there cannot be other alternatives to solve this problem, right? I believe that if it's possible for like the existing mechanisms such as better counseling or better simply better social support for dismantled families would suffice, right? But more importantly, I think it boils down to the fact that they have never proved to us why achieving or why using this pill to help these sort of kids in the short term is worth it, right? It is why do this at the expense of other children's right to self-expression, as what my partner has mentioned just now, right? We give you the characterization that there exist many conservative parents and that why they are more likely to use the pill than other parents, and why conservative parents are numerically more than tiger parents that OG talk about, or why they are numerically more than kids who are suffering from severe emotional trauma in the cases closing government is talking about, right? But more importantly, we believe that government's whip's rebuttal on how we actually social norms on both sides exist and it's non-comparative. We contest this idea because we believe that if punishments or social punishments are so extreme that that means that in those cases, parents will not even need to use this pill in the first place to control their children. And so we believe that in cases where conservative parents use this pill to force children to act in socially acceptable way, such as not to cross-dress in certain conservative communities, it means that in the status quo, they do not have any mechanism or tangible, effective way to control behaviors outside of the household. And this is exactly what Steffi is talking about, right? We believe that in the status quo, parents, they have less ability to control their children outside of the household, especially for teenagers. And we believe that this policy actually extends this reach of parental authority, especially for conservative parents, outside of the household, because presumably you can force your children to take this pill before they can go out, right? And therefore, if this is the case, or why is this the case, right? We believe that at most in our world, indoctrination or these sort of parental authority exists within the household. We do not necessarily think that they can control behaviors outside. But more importantly, right, responding to OG's POI, right, I believe that there are many kids who say they're LGBT or they have their own unique identity. Their unique identity is established partially through rebelling against socially acceptable behaviors, right? And therefore, we believe that this is important because if these children who live under conservative parents and in conservative societies, they cannot express themselves through behaviors outside of the household, they are unable to, say, access external support networks. For example, transgender children, because they are not socially acceptable to cross-dress, they actually will not be able to interact with other transgender children or teenagers outside of household. But more importantly, we believe that they will actually have a kind of cognitive dissonance in the sense that once the pill's effect has gone, they will start to think, what the hell am I doing, right? We believe that this sort of discontinuity between their own inner self and beliefs and their behaviors is ultimately detrimental to the development of their identity. But before I go on, yes.
Trigger warning again, but presumably this developmental argument also works both ways. If you experience a very negative experience at a young age, then presumably it will scar you for your life to the extent that you wouldn't be able to do this in the future.
Right. So we believe that if children are from a very young age, very severely affected and hence in the long term cannot develop their identity, we don't see why this is detrimental to our case, right? Because ultimately what we are talking about is the children who cannot be controlled effectively by conservative parents who want to do so, and this policy extends this power for them, right? For those children who are severely affected and hence cannot develop the self-identity, we don't think, they at your best case, they're equally worse off. I don't see why this is, this matters, right? But more importantly, why is this sort of self-expression or identity building especially important during childhood, right? As my partner has mentioned, it is because when you are, going through your teenage years, you have much more opportunity to try out different kinds of behaviors, try out different kinds of subcultures, etc., to actually, throughout the years, develop your own unique character. Why is this important? Because we believe that without these sorts of behaviors, one cannot actually present their inner self, their inner beliefs to others, right? And one's identity is actually based on how others will perceive you, right? If you go out as, you know that you're transgender, but because you're taking the pill, you cannot cross-dress, you cannot cross-dress and express yourself as the other gender. We believe that this is the case in which you cannot express yourself. And this also leads back to the point on how you will then face cognitive dissonance in the sense that you are discontinued, right? And therefore, we believe that ultimately closing government's point on how there will be long-term agency in living out the conception of a good life is fundamentally flawed, right? Because we do not believe that there is an objective conception of a good life, right? Each person is unique, and especially for children, right? And therefore, what we have proven to you, we have exclusively given you why the most conservative parents, who are numerous in amount, will have a strong incentive to use this pill in order to extend their reach to children and to shape their identity, right? But we do not think that ultimately this is something that the parents ought to do, and we ought to protect the rights of children to express themselves in bad situations, right? And when they're living in conservative communities, where their identities, the only way for them to establish their identity is through rebellion and through presenting themselves as socially unacceptable, right, in some ways. And therefore, this impact outweighs everything that has been said in the debate. We take it. Thank you.
I thank the opposition whip and welcome everyone to. Do we go into the breakout room or?
So the teams stay in here. They just go to the breakout room for deliberation and then come back from there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
The room is open. Yeah, the room is open. Should do.